Professor, what is the NDP? I've heard that study several times. NDP is what?
So it's a $25 million study on rats and mice that was supposed to demonstrate that there were no effects of radiation below thermal. And in fact, it demonstrated exactly the opposite. And it follows on the heels of two major studies on animals that said exactly the same thing.
And that study was designed perfectly to make sure that it cannot be challenged, that there will not be any doubt. That's why it took them 14 years.
Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut exposed that Big Wireless and the FCC have failed to do adequate independent studies into the effects of emerging 5G technology. At a Senate Commerce Committee hearing, Blumenthal questioned industry representatives about the absence of this research.
In December of 2018, I sent a letter to FCC Commissioner Carr asking him to cite for me recent scientific studies demonstrating the safety of this technology. What research has been done, where has it been published and compiled. He has essentially failed to do so and just echoed the general statements of the FDA, which shares regulatory responsibility for cell phones with the FCC. If you go to the FDA website, pretty unsatisfactory. There basically is a cursory and superficial citation to existing scientific data saying, quote, the FDA has urged the cell phone industry to take a number of steps, including support additional research on possible biological effects of radio frequency fields for the type of signal emitted by cell phones. I believe that Americans deserve to know what the health effects are. My question for you, particularly Mr. Gillen and Mr. Perry, how much money has the industry committed to supporting additional independent research? I stress independent research. Is that independent research ongoing? Has any been completed? Where can consumers look for it? And we're talking about research on the biological effects of this new technology.
Thank you, Senator. I think, thank you for your focus on the issue. Safety is paramount, and as you alluded to, we rely on the expert agencies, we rely on the findings of the FDA and others as to the requirements to keep all of us safe. There are no industry-backed studies, to my knowledge right now. Happy to visit with you as to what opportunities you think there needs to be more studies, and we're always for more science. We also rely on what the scientists tell us.
At the end of the exchange, Blumenthal concluded,
So there really is no research ongoing. We're kind of flying blind here, so far as health and safety is concerned. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
as more health professionals, politicians, and scientists speak out against the dangers of 5G and EMFs, the cellular industry and some in the mainstream media have begun pushing back. In March 2019, William Broad of the New York Times wrote a piece promoting the idea that those who are concerned about the health effects of 5G are simply falling prey to Russian propaganda designed to make America lose the race to 5G. His article, "Your 5G phone won't hurt you, but Russia wants you to think otherwise," sought to place the blame for concern around 5G on the shoulders of America's favorite boogeymen, the Russians.
Interestingly, Broad failed to mention that in April 2019, the Times announced a partnership with Verizon to showcase a 5G journalism lab. This seems to be a new trend for corporate media, as the Washington Post announced a similar deal with AT&T in November 2019. Questions regarding potential conflicts of interest have not been addressed.
Most insurance companies will not indemnify against EMF effects. Telecom companies around the world are warning their investors of potential major costs due to real or alleged risks of EMF pollution from their products. Interestingly enough, they're warning their investors, but they're not telling their customers. They're basically keeping it quiet because that's where their money comes from. So we're using technology that could be very potentially harmful to us, and the investors know it. But their only worry is that they might lose money, not that our health might be affected.
first of all, I think what you should really think about is why is it that they're not insured? It's not that they chose to be self-insured. They actually rejected by the insurance company from being insured because they understand the risk. And
So
if
the
they
insurance
understand
companies, the big insurance companies,
So there's
will not
okay.
insure the
So
telecommunication?
there's insurance companies, and then there's what's called secondary insurance companies. Secondary insurance companies are the insurance companies that insure the insurance companies. So in an event, an insurance company, let's say I insure Verizon, and it may not be able to meet the claims, then the secondary insurance company is kicking in.
Like Lloyd's of London?
Sorry?
Like
Yes,
Lloyd's of
exactly.
London.
So two leading one would be Lloyd's of London and Swiss Re. Both told the insurance company not to insure the wireless industry, and this is why they're not insured. And that should give you a hint. Now, this is exactly why they have to prevent a health lawsuit. And how did they prevent lawsuit? That goes back to Section 704. Section 704 was passed in 1996. This is how our rights in regards to health were taken away by the wireless industry. What this legislation did, it gave the power to regulate the health effects of wireless technology to the FCC. FCC is a spectrum auctioning agency. It's not a health agency. They don't even have one biomedical person on their team. And then the other thing that Section 704 did, it actually took the power from the state to regulate location of cell towers based on health. And what does it mean? It means that if they want to put a cell tower in front of your home, you cannot go to your city council and say, hey, stop, I don't want it. I just heard in a lecture that there are 10,000 studies proving that it's harmful. I don't want it. My child is sick. They will tell you, stop. You're not allowed to mention this in the city council because Section 704 says that if you will, and if the application will be rejected, the city will be sued, can be sued by the wireless industry.
Why is the media and their slated scientists, talking heads, always giving us conflicting information on this topic? Why are they saying it's probably safe, and who has something to gain by leading us astray? Well, Jerry Phillips used to work conducting research for Motorola. His perspective on this is very insightful.
The radio frequency radiation work that we did was supported by Motorola. The relationship was really very cordial and very stress-free, but only up until we started generating data. These folks were very, very upset and began to talk about how are they going to handle this, what sort of spin can we put on this, what can we expect from this. Motorola began to exert more and more control over the work, telling us what to do, telling us how to write abstracts, what to say in the abstracts, what to say in the papers. This was unacceptable. I had completed our study of DNA damage, and I submitted the final report to Motorola. They simply weren't willing to accept my interpretation of my study, my knowledge of science, and tried to urge me not to publish the study. I stopped taking calls from them.
This is Dr. George Carlo. He was the chief scientist hired to oversee studies investigating the safety of cell phones and their possible relationship to creating brain tumors.
There are no studies that have been done on people who use mobile phones that provide conclusive evidence of safety.
His previous work as an epidemiologist could be considered shady when you consider that he worked for companies like Dow Chemical in their days of the Agent Orange debacle. Perhaps that past got him in the door with big telecom, but when he instead started revealing cancer risks, his funding was pulled and his house was apparently burned down. Surely a coincidence.
You have studies that show problems or potential problems and studies that are inconclusive. Now, the industry spins the science as though these studies are evidence of safety. It is scientific fraud.
Dr. Deborah Davis, president of the Environmental Health Trust, Nobel Prize-winning oncologist with 40 years experience, she helped get smoking banned from airplanes and more recently has turned her studies to RF.
There's a tremendous amount of sponsored research by people who are hired to do studies to find no effect. And that's plagued this field in a number of countries.
Dr. Henry Ley was initially funded by the Office of Naval Research in the 70s to investigate how radar, which emits RF, affects the health of radar operators. Well, He performed studies using microwave radiation at levels considered safe by our government on the DNA of rats. And after telecom giant Motorola got wind of his findings that a mere 2-hour exposure broke DNA in their brains, a full-scale effort to discredit his work ensued.
Lots of time when you listen to the industry, the comments is that the majority of data show no effect. That is not true.
What is true is that researchers have looked at many hundreds of cell phone radiation studies to see what the biological effects are. Overall, they find that about half the studies find effect and half find no effect. However, when you group the studies based upon the funding source, you find the studies funded by industry typically find no effect, and the independent studies find negative biological effects. Makes sense to me that we need more funding towards independent studies, but in America, that has been the opposite of what has happened.
Sadly, almost all the research done now is by big telecom, as independent science has been completely defunded.
Our federal government has totally shut down all funding for this kind of research, and that's been the case for, 20 years?
Why there is no funding?
For a variety of reasons. We have a very aggressive telecommunications industry.
The FCC is a capture agency. They probably conducted what I believe to be the biggest fraud on the public ever conducted.
The FCC has been described by Harvard University's Center for Ethics writer Norman Alster as the most captured agency in D.C., acting more as an industry cheerleader than a regulator. This is especially true today with 5G, where there are serious safety concerns and potentially misleading information coming from the FCC.
For example, the previous chairman of the FCC is Tom Wheeler. He was the head of the Wireless Lobby Association for 14 years. Now remember, Obama told us there would be no lobbyists in his administration, so he took the biggest lobby and put him as a head of the FCC.
And that's damn important.
In 1993, the FCC started a rulemaking to adopt the IEEE regulations on this issue. IEEE is an engineer association. Why is it that we adopt regulation of engineers who maybe know how to measure this radiation when it's passing a wall, but not when it's passing a body? All our health agencies objected it, saying that it makes no sense to adopt engineer association, that they had not even one biomedical person on their team.
They are effectively indemnified against adverse health impact lawsuits when the acceptable limits are higher than the limits actually shown to show harmful health effects.
The FCC guidelines were developed for short-term exposures, 6 minutes, 30 minutes, depending on it's a phone or an outdoor exposure. And they have absolutely no connection to the biological effects that have been very clearly summarized in the Bio Initiative.
The captured agency report makes it clear that this type of corruption takes place because of the, quote, free flow of executive leadership between the FCC and the industries it presumably oversees. For example, at the time of the report's release, the chairman of the FCC was Tom Wheeler, a man with deep ties to the big wireless industry. In 2013, Wheeler was nominated as FCC chairman by Obama after raising more than $700,000 for Obama's presidential campaign.
And so today, it is my great pleasure to nominate Tom Wheeler to take his place. Now, if anybody's wondering about Tom's qualifications, Tom is the only member of both the Cable Television and the Wireless Industry Hall of Fame. And that's because for more than 30 years, Tom's been at the forefront of some of the very dramatic changes that we've seen in the way we communicate and how we live our lives.
Wheeler led the two most powerful industry lobbying groups, the National Cable and Telecommunications Association and the Cellular Telecommunications and Internet Association, or the CTIA. The current chairman of the FCC could also be seen as another example of a captured agency in action. Ajit Pai, a lawyer and current chairman of the FCC, served as Associate General Counsel at Verizon Communications between 2001 and 2003, where he handled competition and regulatory matters. Pai was appointed to the FCC by Barack Obama in 2012 and then made FCC chairman by Donald Trump in January 2017.